Research with the National Agricultural and Rural Development Policy Center, and we're pleased to be hosting today's webinar on natural gas extraction issues and policy options. Our presenters today are Shannon Ferrell and Larry Sanders, both from Oklahoma State University. Take it away.
Hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. Shannon and I will be sharing with you what we've learned from researching this topic over the last few months. I want to start first by expressing our appreciation to the National Agricultural and Rural Development Policy Center for providing the grant, specifically to Scott Loveridge and Don Albrecht for providing the coordination and the editorship for what we have done to date, and to Rosa Solis for her administrative assistance. The papers, as he said, are either available now from NARDEP or they will be shortly available from NARDEP or us as the authors, and I'll explain that shortly. I just want to give you a brief overview, an outline of where we're headed today. We're going to start with a brief background of the methods we used and the technical foundation of what we're about. We're really talking about hydraulic fracturing and the issues that flow out of that to areas and localities. The issues we decided to break into two broad categories: environmental and community. There's an array of research available on those, and there's a shortage of research available in each of those areas. Where we start, though, in the methodology that we're using is a public policy methodology known as alternatives and consequences, or options and consequences. And here we start with framing the issue in an objective, non-controversial manner, and we'll get to that shortly. The options and consequences model is generally coming from the standpoint of local communities, other government entities are faced broadly with the choices of maintaining the status quo in response to various public concerns, or choosing to ratchet up government involvement, or perhaps deciding to reduce government involvement. And each of those broad alternatives have a variety of consequences that are very significant. And finally, we'll close with some examples that are real. They have either been tried and tested in various places, or there is the potential for them to be based on historical precedent. Where I'm going to start now is to briefly highlight the methods that we used and the technical aspects of hydraulic fracturing. We did not do any original primary research in preparing for these papers or this webinar. We did as thorough a review of literature as we could reasonably do with the resources and the time available. And in fact, if you go back in history to the beginnings of the oil and gas exploration and development in our country, and as we move forward into the middle and later stages of the 20th century, there's lots of information available. There's also lots of information available historically, science, peer-reviewed research on community impacts, specifically boom-bust cycles that occur when you have resource extraction. Where we begin to see a shortage of research available in the literature as we move into the last decade or two, where hydraulic fracturing really takes off, and there's been little research done or completed in that area. The options and consequences model, again, has grown out of the public policy education methodology. And here we choose to come from a perspective that we as scientists, as researchers, do not hold or have an acknowledgement of truth with a capital T. Rather, if we can find research that is credible, scientific, peer-reviewed, and or theoretical foundations that are available, that we can provide the outlines of what options may be available to the public and various governmental entities, and from that we can draw out what the likely consequences might be of implementing any of those array of options. And then we sit back and we let the public, we let the decision makers decide what happens from there using that scientific foundation that may be available. With response to the technical aspects, most of that is going to be left to the technical paper that will soon be available from NARDEP or the authors. But I just want to begin by giving a very, very broad and rudimentary, simplistic outline of what we're talking about. Hydraulic fracturing, commonly known as fracking today, is where the focus of our paper is. And this is not a new technology. It's more than a half century old. It was in heavy use in the mid part of the 20th century and beyond, primarily with vertical drilling wells where it was economical for the extraction companies to pump drilling mud, fracturing fluids, if you will, that are a composite of a variety of materials into the well, adding pressure to the well, and that allows more of the gas and oil to be extracted. What the difference that has taken place recently has been revolving around is its use where they begin to go down at the base of the vertical well and move laterally, horizontally, if you will, oftentimes several thousand feet, and begin to pump in drilling mud at a much higher rate and much more intensity. And that has begun to allow extraction of oil and gas that was not previously available on an economic basis. And I'll leave any further discussion of that to Shannon or to the technical paper. The policy and regulatory history here, as I said, there's lots of information available on the general exploration and extraction of oil and natural gas up through the latter part of the 20th century, where we begin to find some difficulty of finding a deep and rich base of research is within the last decade or so, as the hydraulic fracturing has just become so much more significant way of life for the natural gas industry. But there is some available, and we have relied on that to the extent that we can. Where the community issues come into play, it's often provided, we find it's more fruitful to go back a couple of decades and look at some of the boom-bust cycle research that was done at that time, unrelated to hydraulic fracturing, but nonetheless related to natural resource extraction, and the rudimentary options there still apply.
All right, well, Larry has teed up kind of the background of our issue, and then that leads us to kind of classifying what some of the policy questions are confronting both local communities, state governments, and even the federal government as they work on responses to the issues that are raised both at the environmental level and at the community level as a result of the expansion of natural gas extraction. And we necessarily had to divide those issues up into those two broad categories, environmental and community, because we found in our review of the literature that that seems to be kind of how the discussions naturally tend to break out. So let's talk then about some of the issues within each of those domains. First off, you'll see that many folks have kind of general environmental concerns, and that might just be arising out of a lack of knowledge as to exactly what hydraulic fracturing entails and what its environmental impacts could be, never mind what they might actually be. So first off, there just seems to be a kind of a lack of awareness about some of the issues around hydraulic fracturing and natural gas extraction. Broad-based concerns, what is fracturing and what is oil and gas extraction, because as you may see, the advance of these technologies has pushed oil and gas exploration into regions that may not have ever seen it before. You know, in some states like Pennsylvania and Oklahoma, we've seen oil and gas extraction going on for the past century, but in other states, this is a relatively new phenomenon, and with that newness brings lots of concerns. If there was to be one particular environmental issue that I think dominates the discussion, it's the impacts of hydraulic fracturing to water. And there's a wide range of those issues, including how much water is being used for fracturing, which is quite a bit depending on the formation, whether or not those materials can be spilled at the surface and cause water quality impacts. What are the impacts of injecting hydraulic fracturing fluid, and what is in that stuff anyway? As Larry was alluding to earlier, hydraulic fracturing now is a little bit different than the technology that we first saw introduced back in the late 1940s. Now what we're trying to do is to create new fractures in these geologic formations that hold oil and natural gas in relatively tight formations that doesn't want to let it go. So we're trying to create new fractures, and to do that we might include acids in the fluid to make sure that those fissures can be dissolved wider. We might be including things like biocides to make sure that bacteria don't build up and block those fractions. And so more and more there are a much broader array of chemicals being used, and that's what led to a lot of the public concern about hydraulic fracturing fluids itself, much less the actual injection process. Lastly, we have lots of wastewaters that are produced from this process. You may be drawing a lot of salt water up from these formations, and so that begs the question, how do we treat and release that produced water? To give you an anecdotal example, here in Oklahoma, this is a big concern because some of our formations are yielding tremendous amounts of salt water, and the disposal of that salt water is starting to erode some of the profitability of those oil and gas ventures, to the point they're wondering, can they produce these formations not based on the economics of production, but rather on the economics of disposal of the wastewater? Air issues are fairly common to those associated with most oil and gas production. There are a couple of differences. First off, depending on the intensity of the oil and gas exploration, or the natural gas extraction especially, you might have a significant number of operators in a relatively small area, and that can create some local air quality concerns. There are some studies, specifically in the Wyoming fields, that have shown that air quality in rural areas may be less than those of major metro areas just due to the concentration of activity there. Another somewhat unique concern when we're talking about hydraulic fracturing and air emissions is the fact that the fluid that's produced from the wells can off-gas. In other words, it can release methane and some other volatile organic compounds as those fluids are stored, and that has led to some air quality concerns also. Solid waste concerns, again, are fairly common as to those that are usually associated with oil and gas production, disposing of the used drill cuttings and the drill mud that's used in the wells. A concern that's a little bit more unique to the natural gas extraction process is handling NORM. NORM stands for normally occurring radioactive material, and usually these materials emit radiation only at levels that are comparable to background in the area. But some shale formations that have been used for natural gas extraction have shown higher concentrations of NORM, and so that's led to some concerns about disposal there. Lastly, whenever we see a large expansion of an environmentally sensitive industry, we always worry about who's going to be around to pay for the damage if the damage is done. And in some cases, some companies have had to file bankruptcy because they weren't able to pay for those environmental damages. And so that leaves those damages in some cases unpaid for. So that kind of leads to the question in the public's eye of how do we handle who's left holding the purse strings when we've got an issue such as that. From the community perspective, anytime we talk about an increased level of government response to any sort of policy issue, regardless of what it is, we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to fund that response, and how are we going to allocate those revenues in a way that's fair based on which jurisdictions are sustaining the costs and which jurisdictions are accruing the benefits. We also need to be very cautious about engaging community stakeholders to make sure everyone's voice is heard and that we can get people involved, because as we see levels of involvement increase, we've actually seen some of the other sociological issues decrease in that respect. If we've got a large number of people moving into the area to seek employment in the extractive industry, we have to start worrying about housing availability, not only for those that are coming to the area, but also for those that may be on fixed or low incomes, especially if we have so much demand for housing that prices start to rise. There's a number of sociological impacts associated with a large boom cycle, so to speak, and the literature is fairly rich on that point, and we won't talk about each of these issues. Suffice it to say, there are a number of negative sociological impacts raised in the literature when we have a significant influx of new population, as is often occasioned by resource development, especially natural gas development, and sometimes the demographics of that population influx, especially if it's young males. The literature seems to indicate that's another topic that kind of exacerbates some of those sociological issues. From the education perspective, we often have to think about providing education for the families that are already in the area, and if new families move in, will there be sufficient facilities available for them? We also hope that we can take advantage of this boom by employing local citizens, and that means we have to have not only enough people available to work, but that they have the skills and the talents necessary for that industry. And if not, we're probably going to see a large influx of external workers as well. Whenever we have a large, intense exploration industry, like we have in natural gas exploration, we're going to see a lot of truck traffic. And lots of truck traffic usually means a lot of use of local roads, and that can lead to increased maintenance requirements. So we have to ask ourselves, do we have the infrastructure in place to support the industry? Do we need to expand it? Or do we also need to concern ourselves with the increased cost of repair for that infrastructure? That's obviously an issue in the natural gas industry. From a landowner perspective, there are a number of aesthetic impacts that usually raise concerns, both visual and auditory issues. But then whenever we have a circumstance where the surface owner may be different than the mineral interest owner, now we have a benefit and burdens accrual problem or externality problem. We may see that the surface owner is bearing the vast majority of burdens in natural gas extraction, while a mineral interest owner is accruing most of the benefits. How do we go about balancing those issues? And furthermore, how do we go about making sure that landowners, whether they be mineral or surface or both, can negotiate good agreements that are mutually beneficial for both them and the natural resource extractor or the developer, and avoid too many asymmetries of information there? With that, I'll turn it back over to Larry to talk a little bit about our analysis framework.
Okay, so you've heard some of the background about the methods we've used. You've heard Shannon talk about what some of the key issues are on the environmental side and the community side. These are not surprising to most of you, I suspect. Some of you have perhaps even been on the inside dealing with these issues in very contentious ways. And our attempts here today is to try to lay a framework, a foundation, that while it won't solve all of the contention, it may help reduce the heat surrounding it. And here we're talking about trying to arrive at a point of common ground where all sides can have some general agreement to sit down at the table and start the dialogue about what the actual issues are and what the alternatives for resolving those are. So here we think that probably all sides can have some general agreement that quality of life is really at the heart of this issue, depending on how that is defined by the various sides. But affecting that is how can the natural gas be extracted through hydraulic fracturing in an economical manner that will provide additional resources to the nation, to the region, and by doing that there will be additional economic development in the areas of exploration and extraction, and the most obvious indicator of that is typically a large influx of new jobs and laborers to fill those jobs at various levels. But at the same time, where the hardcore issues arise is how do we do this in a way that we can continue to maintain and enhance the environment, and by the same token maintain and enhance community well-being, because those are really foundational for the quality of life of any community or region that we're talking about. So where the contention really comes from is trying to determine what the role of government is and what the level of responsibility of the industry is to respond to this. So how do we provide this economic foundation that includes economic development, jobs, energy at reasonable prices while we're maintaining and protecting the environment? So we want to get these resources and some level of quality of life where we want it, when we want it, how much we want, and at a price that we choose to have as a group. So start from that framing of the issue that is relatively generic, but one in which it is hoped that some of the heat can be reduced, some of the contention can be reduced, so it will allow the various sides to sit down and begin to take a hard look at what the options are. And so we start here from a very generic foundation that we can either continue to maintain the status quo and stick with what those status quo opportunities are, or we can go to more involvement with the government, or we can have less involvement by the government. So let me just take each of these options one at a time. If we recognize that the status quo is in fact a complex patchwork of a myriad of choices made from local government level through state government level through the federal level, involving sometimes choosing to do nothing, sometimes choosing to go to an extreme of having a moratorium, sometimes choosing to have exemptions for the industry. Putting that all together, generally what we see as we look out on the environment of the status quo today is that we have seen an explosion in natural gas supplies that has caused the natural gas prices to fall. At the same time, anecdotally and to some extent by scientific research, we are seeing that there are problems with diminished quality to the water, diminished quantity of water because of the incredible amounts of water that are required for this, and whether or not they're able to treat it sufficiently for recycling and reuse. At the same time, what many of these communities are benefiting from, at least in the very short run, is an infusion for economic development and expansion of the job base, both additional jobs for those in the community and for those new influx of laborers into or near the community. At the same time, we're beginning to see the beginnings of this boom-bust cycle and what results from that, as Shannon indicated, with the likelihood that there may be real problems in what the community has to deal with when the boom turns to a bust. The exploration and extraction companies leave the area, plug the wells, and are not there anymore to respond to the roads that may have been damaged. The tax base has been expanded temporarily, and now there's not a tax structure to pay for additional schools and other infrastructure, so on and so forth. And that issue is very real right now. Landowners, if they are the ones that are being paid for rents or purchase of mineral rights or use of property or use of water, are finding significant profit from this, some overnight millionaires. At the same time, some of those landowners and some who don't get the benefit of being paid by the industry are seeing some adverse impacts, such as abuse of the soil, perhaps contamination of it, extraction of water that they might otherwise be able to use for other uses, and the opportunity costs that result from that, and other environmental impacts such as the possibility of air pollution in the area of the mines. So one option that some communities are deciding on is having more government involvement. And here I might just parenthetically add what Shannon has alluded to, but there are real and serious jurisdictional issues ongoing as we speak. Some of these will be litigated, some of them will be worked out in state legislatures, Some of them will have to be determined by federal legislation or rulemaking by the various agencies that come into play in this. But to the extent possible, there are some communities that and other government entities that are deciding to say, in response to our concerns for the variety of issues, environmental and community, we are going to regulate more, we are going to ban more, we are going to institute more rulemaking, we are going to institute perhaps more taxes or requirements for mandated funds to protect against future problems. These responses will necessarily drive up the price of natural gas. They'll likely cause some instability in supply. Could be worked out at a later time, but likely short-run impacts. If they work the way the government entities hope they will work, there will certainly be some further protection of air and water and soil from some of those concerns of pollution and contamination. And because of the additional regulations, it's likely to slow down the exploration and extraction, the development of these resources by the industry. So that's going to, in turn, cause some slowdown in economic development and job growth. Landowner profits are likely not going to be there to the extent that they had been under the status quo. But the government entities will be able to have funds to begin to help mitigate some of the problems that they are concerned about incurring in that area. Alternatively, some government entities may choose to back off and say this is a problem that the market can best resolve, or perhaps a partnership between government and the private entities and requiring less government involvement, less heavy hand of government. That's probably going to cause an intensification of exploration and extraction of the resource, and so we'll probably see even lower natural gas prices. We'll likely see increased supply in the short run, which may take away from future generations. If the early research is right, if the concerns of some in the communities are right, this could result in more adverse and long-term adverse impacts to the environment and the community, and perhaps have less funds available to respond to those. So more jobs, more economic development in that very localized area, and perhaps an increase in the environmental problems that result from that. Shannon?
Okay, well, now down to how we actually go about fixing all this stuff, right? Because we came up with all the easy answers to these issues. Just kidding. If you look at a lot of the issues, what we try to do with our research is to try to find some examples of how communities or governments at any level, local, state, or federal, were addressing some of these issues, or if they weren't, if some of the available literature had talked about approaches that could be used to address these issues. Now, when it comes to dealing with the general environmental concerns of, the community not just not having enough information about the issue, lots of communities have tried to respond by using a moratorium on drilling, at least within the area of their jurisdiction, to kind of put a pause on things until more information can be acquired. Now, many times we're seeing these community-based moratoria being struck down by state courts as exceeding the authority of that local government. So as Larry and I have alluded to earlier in the presentation, there are very real jurisdictional and authority issues around community responses to the natural gas extraction issues, simply because local governments may not have the authority to respond to those issues. So moratoria has had more success at the state level. Of course, about the New Jersey and the New York moratoria, and there are some regional authorities that have examined that possibility as well. Obviously, we in the research business like to see more calls for increased research, but I don't think that's just us. I think there have been fairly consistent calls from all sectors that there needs to be more information gathered about the specific impacts of hydraulic fracturing and natural gas extraction, not just on the environmental issues, but on the community-based issues as well. We could spend a long time talking about some of the solutions to the water quality issues, and generally the solutions that we found available were just more regulation. I know that's not terribly creative, but there does seem to be a call for there to be a little bit more involvement at either the federal or state level in handling some of the water-based impacts of hydraulic fracturing. A couple that I would draw your attention to, for those of you that don't spend all your time reading environmental laws like I do, you may or may not know that the Safe Drinking Water Act regulates underground injection of fluids within a certain scope. Now, there is a specific exemption for hydraulic fracturing under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So Safe Drinking Water Act regulations do not apply to wells that are used for hydraulic fracturing. So one significant level of increased government involvement on that issue would be to remove that exemption and bring hydraulic fracturing under the Safe Drinking Water Act. There is actually federal legislation on that point proposed, but it has not yet been approved. The other item that's been getting a lot of attention is fluid disclosure requirements. Many states are now starting to impose requirements that hydraulic fracturing operations disclose both the volume and the content of their hydraulic fracturing fluids. There's also a very significant private voluntary effort through the Frac Focus website. That's www.fracfocus, focus.org, where companies are voluntarily disclosing those amounts. On the air side, the federal government actually has proposed regulations for what are called green completion of wells, but that regulation is currently being held in abeyance by EPA pending some litigation on that point. There are also opportunities to increase emissions limits from a number of different sources on site for a well, or to require that fluids that are produced be stored in sealed vessels and the emissions from those vessels regulated. On the solid waste perspective, again, there is a significant federal exemption for oil and gas exploration and production wastes from RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. That act, as you probably know, deals largely with solid waste disposal. Removing that exemption would put those wastes back under either federal or delegated state authority and would be kind of a significant policy shift. Regulations for handling NORM could also be imposed. On the federal side, we could enact rules that would limit the dischargeability of environmental liabilities in bankruptcy. Currently, there are no such restrictions in place, but there are other debts that are not dischargeable in bankruptcy, and we could add environmentals to those lists if we chose to. At the state level, we could say that your entity could not be dissolved if you have outstanding environmental liabilities, or we could make those liabilities personal to the officers or shareholders of the corporation. Now, that would be a pretty unprecedented step, but it is one alternative that's out there. On the community perspective, when we talk about financing issues, what we usually come back to is some form of severance tax. In other words, a tax that is imposed on the separation of a mineral resource from the ground. And that can take two basic flavors. One of those is an ad valorem tax. That is a tax that is imposed based on the value of the commodity that's extracted, or a fixed tax, and that tax is a per unit tax. In other words, for every 1,000 cubic feet of gas extracted, some fixed amount will be assessed. Now, there is a rich body of literature on the advantages and disadvantages of both of these taxes, and we even have an appendix in the white paper devoted solely to that topic, so we'll refer you to that. Beyond that, we could look at establishing trust funds to help smooth out some of the boom-bust cycles, at least in public revenue, regarding the extractive industry. We could also look at voluntary funds that are contributed by private entities. Note that using a voluntary approach is probably going to be easier from a negotiating and logistics standpoint if we have one large agent in a particular area versus if we have a large number of small agents working in that area. And then, of course, we always have to make sure that we have the statutory authority in place to make sure that those revenues can be shared between the governments that are accruing the benefits and the burdens of the extractive activity. When it comes to engaging community stakeholders, there are lots of tried and true methods out there, and those are detailed especially in our policy matrix. But we were talking in the side chat about some of those tools being used, such as the Kettering model or the National Issues Forum model. Any of those public discussion models are available and kind of serve the role almost of mediation, and at least that stakeholders feel like their voices can be heard and they can address some of those issues. But that also helps us deal with a number of sociological issues, because the literature seems to suggest that the more engaged, or conversely the less disengaged, our community members are, the more we see improvement in a lot of those sociological impacts. From the housing perspective, if you really want to divide the solutions that have been tried up into two big categories, they seem to involve either developer-built housing or community-built housing. And if we're talking about community-built housing, obviously we need to have the financing and the personnel available to support and maintain that. We also have the question of what happens to that housing once the very intensive extraction phase goes away and housing demand decreases. Are we now going to have a lot of surplus housing out there that can cause its own problems? We can also look at facilitating or streamlining the approval process of housing, and we can also look at some of the traditional solutions such as voucher or subsidy programs to help people that can't afford housing be more of a market participant. We kind of alluded to this just a couple of moments ago, but when we talk about the sociological impacts, and I won't go into too much detail along each of these items, I'll just say that the literature seems to strongly suggest getting involved. That may seem a little bit oversimplistic, but each of these issues seems to have suggestions in the literature that the more engaged we can get the community and the more public and private partnerships we can create with respect to these issues, the better response we can see, or the more opportunity at least that we have to mitigate those impacts. Availability of education seems to revolve primarily around facilities and around staff. And getting staff into an area is always going to be a challenge because we're probably seeing wage inflation in that area, and so that means we're going to have to pay teachers more, which I know has been a topic of discussion for many years. Temporary facilities for students, maybe in the form of mobile units brought into areas, or providing alternative arrangements such as online classes, or even encouraging homeschooling in some areas, are also approaches that have been used. Trying to develop an appropriate workforce means that we have to develop skills, and that might give us a really great opportunity to establish public and private partnerships so that we can know what those skills need to be, and to have the private sector help us develop the educational models that we need to address those concerns. There actually are a couple of issues, or examples, excuse me, of this working to fairly good effect, both in the oil and gas industry, but also in renewables, especially in areas where you see lots of wind energy development taking place these days. Transportation infrastructure seems to come back fundamentally to dealing with road repairs. I know that seems kind of a pedestrian issue, but how do we go about enforcing that? We can do that through weight limits and basically assessing fines in kind of almost a punitive model, or we can establish well fees or some other sort of permit fee and specifically allocate some of those fees to dealing with those infrastructure mitigation issues. Conversely, we can also establish public and private partnerships to address those issues just by providing offset or mitigation funds from the private sector players. Again, we'll go back to our issue with that. If we've got one large operator in an area, that probably makes that an easier solution to implement than if we have a lot of smaller operators in the area. When we talk about aesthetic impacts, a lot of that comes just from aesthetic mitigation. That can come from operating hour restrictions, barriers, both visual and auditory, or it may come from establishing setback or siting requirements or permitting. Again, this is an avenue that lots of local governments have tried to use to deal with a lot of oil and gas issues, not just from the aesthetic perspective, but just generally. And again, that's the area where we're seeing a lot of these regulations being struck down because state courts are determining that they exceed the jurisdictional capacity of those governments to implement. Some states have surface damage acts that deal with the amount of compensation that needs to be paid to a surface owner if they're not the mineral owner and are basically accruing more than their fair share, so to speak, of the burdens, excuse me, rather than the benefits of development. We could look at establishing that sort of legislation in areas where that's not available, and we can also focus efforts on developing more landowner education programs to reduce the asymmetry of information and bargaining power between the landowners and the oil and gas developers, and give them more alternatives to develop on their own private agreements that help balance those benefits and burdens that we've talked about.
Okay, thank you, Shannon. So in conclusion, let's just kind of come to the acceptance that while we have much research available to us historically, we are just in the beginning, early stages of getting rich results from scientifically peer-reviewed research on which to base our decisions, our analysis. Many of you listening have anecdotal evidence, and not to question the validity or the veracity of those anecdotes. They are an important part of arriving at resolution of the problems. I think to begin to implement regulations, governmental involvement that is going to affect whether or not the industry can profit, whether or not we can have sustained energy resources, whether or not we can maintain the environment and the community well-being, needs to continue to have more research available. That research is ongoing. There's much of it that we would like to be able to report on, but it is either not yet completed or not yet at the stage of being peer-reviewed. And we expect that to change, and if we talked in 6 months or a year, there would be much more of that available. For those of you who are not used to working with economists, there's lots of buzzwords in the papers that I encourage you to find more about, and working with public economists at land-grant universities might be a good starting point, but concepts such as opportunity cost, externalities, whether they be positive or negative, benefit cost analysis, trying to determine appropriate discount rates, are all very important to many of the potential resolutions to some of the concerns that many of you are facing with this huge expansion of exploration and extraction through hydraulic fracturing. We would like to thank you for tuning in today. Shannon and I can be contacted directly by email, or you can go through NARDEP, and as I said, the policy paper, which is central to this, is available from NARDEP now. The policy alternatives matrix is available now. The policy briefing paper is available. The technical paper will soon be available from NARDEP or us as the primary authors of it. That concludes our presentation. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. This is a great overview of a rich and complex topic. I would encourage everybody who's interested in this to go up to the top of the chat box and look at those addresses for the 3 papers. The policy brief is just a 2-pager overviewing some of the issues and some of the ideas for addressing them. The white paper provides more detail about those issues, and then the policy matrix is a really nice summary of sort of the pros and cons of various approaches that are in place already in different states of the country trying to work on these issues. So it's a great summary and really hard to do justice to in the short space of 35 or 40 minutes, but I think you guys have done a great job. And we have a few minutes now for folks that want to put questions into the chat box to interact with our 2 experts here. So go ahead and do that, and we'll try to get those answered. And while we're waiting for that to come in, if folks could click on the evaluation, the webinar evaluation poll that is up right now, that would be helpful, so we can get some feedback to our presenters in that way as well. But
Scott,
let me
I
start.
noticed a couple of.
Okay. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Scott. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was going to address a couple of issues that kind of popped up on the chat dialogue. One question was about the incidence of some of the community impacts on older citizens and communities. And while Larry and I didn't focus on those specific demographics within our literature review, the literature that we did review suggested that we probably do see a higher incidence of some of those impacts, and especially crime and fear of crime, and also in the housing impacts, because a lot of older citizens are on fixed incomes, so they may be some of the first people to feel the heat, so to speak, when we have an increased demand for housing in an area. That was certainly indicated in some of the literature that we reviewed. So those concerns are definitely out there. Another question was in regard to the exemption of oil and gas production under the Safe Drinking Water Act and the Underground Injection Control Program, or UIC, and then the exemption of solid waste disposal under RCRA. And the question was, why hasn't there been more debate about that? I assure you, there has been a lot of debate about that. Those two exemptions have been some of the most hotly contested exemptions ever since they were put in place, and these are decades-old provisions, and they have certainly been getting a great deal of attention in the past few years with the expansion of hydraulic fracturing. Why that debate has not come up more into the public forefront, I'm not quite sure, to be honest, but those issues are definitely a topic of debate, and those are the topics of a lot of lobbying efforts on both sides as well. So that is definitely an issue that continues to rage well within the halls of Congress and within the industry and the private sector as well.
And a couple more questions have come in since you were talking.
I see one that was about how long natural gas development has been going on in some areas. Actually, when we get the technical report available to everyone, we actually include a brief history of oil and gas, and specifically natural gas development, in the technical supplement, because for some areas that's been a centuries-old issue, and for others it's been fairly recent. If you look at, for example, let's talk about Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania had the first commercial oil well in North America, but the widespread production of natural gas in that area is actually a fairly recent phenomenon. You often find oil and gas together, but it isn't until the past few years that we've really seen a high emphasis on the production of natural gas itself, even in areas where oil might not be present. I'm looking over here at some of the other areas, some of the zoning regulations when we talk about setbacks. If you'll look at the policy matrix, we include a couple of examples there about some of the zoning ordinances that have been put in place. The examples that we provide in the policy matrix are specifically Arlington and Fort Worth, located in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. They deal specifically with some of those zoning and setback issues and some of the aesthetic impacts as well. Looking here at some of the other chat box questions, and Scott or Larry, if you guys see some, let me know.
Well, while we're waiting for folks to put more chat box things in, let me just point out first that this webinar is archived, or will be archived later today at the address that's listed there in the bottom. And then still would like more people to reply to the webinar evaluation. We're not getting a lot of responses there, and there's still 30 people on, so please click all the questions that apply. But I had a question for you, Shannon, in terms of, you had a very good sorting out of status quo, more active, less active. It might be helpful to folks if you could list out states that may be in those categories, maybe a little bit more.
In response, I'm sorry, Scott, I've dropped out your audio for a second. Could you repeat your question?
Are there, okay, so you've got the three categories of status quo, more involvement, less involvement, and could you list out states that tend to fall into those categories?
Oh, okay, I see. Policies? Oh, yes. That's a good one, because it depends along which dimension. I don't know that I can point to a singular state that we could point to as being more involved across all of those dimensions. I would argue that you could probably make an example in Pennsylvania and New York and New Jersey as being along some of the more active, especially on the environmental front. Because in Pennsylvania you just have, and it's currently the topic obviously of a lot of litigation, so the issue is not well settled, but the passage of Pennsylvania Act 13, which in large part kind of rewrote Pennsylvania's oil and gas code, but very specifically dealt with what they call unconventional natural gas wells, which the layman's translation of that is hydraulically fractured, horizontally drilled wells. So pretty comprehensive environmental issues were addressed with that, as well as a lot of the revenue and revenue allocation issues. At the same time, though, Pennsylvania Act 13 also explicitly preempted a lot of communities from engaging the issues at the local level. In other words, basically prohibiting communities from sharing in those permit fee revenues if they enact zoning restrictions on fracturing there. We haven't really been able to find a really good consensus on the on the community issues, and a lot of the research on that topic is very isolated in terms of looking at very specific examples at a large number of community levels. A good example from the literature of addressing some of the community impacts comes from the several longitudinal studies of Delta, Utah. Now, Delta is kind of an interesting case because Delta, their big boom, so to speak, came from one entity. It was the building of a large coal-fired power plant. But at the same time, a lot of the similarities were there. You had a large influx of workers, lots of community stressors in place. But in the Delta example, the one entity involved, IPP, had very significant mitigation funds voluntarily paid into and in lieu of trust funds, so to speak, to mitigate a lot of those community impacts. So I think there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that. The caution that I would add is, again, there you were kind of talking about a monolithic developer. In other words, there was one large developer at play. In lots of these natural gas fields, there may be dozens of very small independent producers, and it may be difficult to get that level of cooperation or voluntary mitigation without a very significant investment of effort to kind of unify that effort.
If I could just add to what Shannon just said, the western states were probably doing groundbreaking policy making at the community and state level in the 70s and 80s, and the researchers at various public institutions, including the land-grant universities and the Western governors, to do some very good research along the lines of how communities can respond. This wasn't related directly to hydraulic fracturing, of course. It was more due to other extractive industries, natural gas, oil, strip mining of coal, and other minerals. But they are rich in the history of doing research there. Regarding states that are doing more or less, we still see a fairly strong intransigence to more regulation in states like Oklahoma and Texas, but even here we're not seeing very many attempt to move toward the less government option. It is discussed by legislators, by local communities who want to capture the short-term benefits of economic development and job growth, but there's beginning to be stronger kickback from folks who have concerns, legitimate or perceived, about the environmental and community impacts. So most states are in that status quo or more government category.
Oh, thanks. There was a problem with the poll that I've fixed now, so everybody should be able to just click on the boxes that apply. And then once it shows as clicked, then it does register, so you don't have to do anything special to register your information there. If it shows clicked, it will register on the system. So sorry about that, and so if your answers have disappeared, please re-enter them. Looks like Robbie Adams has a question now.
And I was actually just typing a response there. That's a little bit of a different wrinkle because there we're talking about liquefaction of natural gas, and it's bringing onshore, and then you have a lot of issues regarding conversion. You usually have to have a very large conversion facility to get that LNG back to a usable utility form. There are some separate issues there, but Robbie, if you'll contact me later on, I'll coordinate with you and we'll see if we can point you to some references that can get you a base of information on that.
Okay. Well, it looks like the questions have settled down a little bit, so I think maybe we're coming to the end of our time here. I want to thank both of you for an excellent job, and I do encourage everyone on the webinar to take a look at the documents that accompany this. They are posted right next to right where you can find the archive of this session, and there's a lot more detail there for you if you are interested. So thanks a lot.
Thanks everyone for attending. We appreciate you.
Thank you.